think it was somewhere in the Chiricahua Mountains, southeastern Arizona. I remember the dry heat clinging to everything, even as the road started climbing higher and the desert turned into forest. We were a few months into dating, me and my now husband, and for some reason we thought a camping trip with his friends just days after quitting smoking was a good idea. We'd both agreed to quit cold turkey less than a week earlier. It was already getting to me. My hands kept shaking, my chest felt tight, and I could feel that constant itch of agitation you get when you're trying to kick a habit that's buried deep in your brain. But we didn't cancel the trip. We packed the car anyway and started driving. The plan was simple: meet up with a few of his buddies who were already out there, set up camp, and maybe go for a hike or two. I tried to keep my thoughts off everything by watching the scenery change, but it wasn't working. My nerves were wound so tight I ended up crying in the car. Not bawling, not loud, just tears sliding down quietly. My hands clenched in my lap while he kept driving like nothing was happening. I don't even think he noticed for a while, or maybe he just didn't know what to say. Honestly, I didn't either. I didn't want to ruin the trip, and I was too ashamed to say how scared I was. Not of the mountains or the camping, but of how much I wanted a cigarette. The road up into the mountains wasn't paved. It was mostly gravel and dirt, with huge ruts and potholes where rain had chewed through the surface. We were in his old sedan, something low to the ground and not built for rough driving. I was gripping the door handle, my stomach flipping every time we hit a bump. And then, about halfway to camp, it happened. We hit a pothole, deep, hidden in the shadow of a tree, and the whole front end of the car dropped and slammed. The car jolted so hard I heard something underneath scrape. A second later, everything went dead. No engine sound, no power steering, no lights on the dashboard. Just silence. We both just sat there for a second, stunned. The air felt thick, heavier than it had before. My first thought was that we'd just broken something important. Maybe the oil pan had cracked, or we'd busted the suspension. He tried turning the key, but nothing happened. Not even a click. The car was just off. We opened the manual, flipping through pages we didn't understand. It was useless. We were too far from a cell tower to get a signal, and we hadn't passed another car in a good 20 minutes. I started to panic. The tears came back, and I felt trapped in my own skin again. All I wanted in that moment was to light a cigarette, just something to give me a second to breathe. I asked him if he had any. He didn't. People started pulling over, one at a time. Most were friendly. They'd slow down, lean out the window, ask if we needed help. I kept saying the same thing: no, we're good. But do you have a cigarette? They never did. I'd wave them off, then immediately regret it, because maybe they could have helped if I'd let them. But I didn't want help, I wanted nicotine. Every sound made me jump. The birds, the engine sounds in the distance, even the wind in the trees. Eventually, one guy pointed out something in the manual that we'd missed. Apparently, there was a safety mechanism in the car that triggered if it thought it had been in a crash, to shut everything down. There was a reset procedure, and once we followed it, the engine came back to life. We were lucky. If that guy hadn't stopped and known what to look for, we might have been stuck for hours. By the time we pulled into the campsite clearing, I was done, completely drained. My emotions were fried, my body ached from the tension, and my head was pounding from withdrawal. The spot was beautiful. Sure, tall trees, cool breeze, sunlight filtering through the branches, but all I wanted was to crawl into the tent and disappear. So while he went off with his friends to do whatever they do, hike, talk, drink, I stayed behind. I just needed to be alone. He helped set up the tent before heading off. It was one of those older dome tents, the kind that never seems to go up right the first time. We laid out our sleeping bags, tossed in a few bags of clothes, and he left me with some water and snacks in case I got hungry. I curled up inside without changing, my shoes still on, and tried to sleep. That's when it got worse. I must have dozed off, because when I opened my eyes again, the light had shifted. It was later in the day, maybe 2 hours before sunset, and everything had that golden orange hue you only get at high elevation. But something was off. I felt it before I saw it. That thick, prickling feeling across your skin, like being watched. I stayed completely still, listening. There was movement outside the tent. Not footsteps, more like a slow, steady rustle through dry grass and branches. I told myself it was nothing, just wind, maybe a squirrel or something, but it kept going. Something was definitely out there, and it was big. I could hear the weight of it pressing down with every step. Not fast, just slow and deliberate. I sat up quietly, my heart climbing into my throat. Then a shadow passed over the tent wall. It was massive, wide, tall, and unmistakably animal. Not a person. I felt my stomach flip. I knew there had been bear sightings in this area. We'd passed signs on the way up warning about it, how to store food, how to act if you encountered one. But none of it mattered now. I was alone, and there was something huge outside my thin nylon shelter. I didn't move. I barely breathed. I tried to remember what I was supposed to do. Don't make noise. Don't run. Make yourself big. Wait, no, that was for mountain lions. For bears. Play dead? I didn't know. My thoughts were scattered, and the sound outside the tent wasn't helping. Then I heard it huff. A loud, short exhale. Not a snort, not a growl, but something heavy. Then a slow shift, the sound of hooves or paws, dragging through dirt. I couldn't take it anymore. I needed to see what I was dealing with. I reached toward the corner of the tent where I'd left my glasses, but they weren't there. I realized I'd set them outside, near my boots, when I first came in. Everything was blurry without them, and I couldn't make out the shape of the thing outside. I made a decision. A stupid one, probably, but I was panicking. I figured if I made it to the car, I could lock the doors and wait. I knew the keys were still in my backpack, right next to the driver's seat. I reached slowly for the zipper, then paused. The shadow outside shifted again, and I froze, turned slightly. I saw the outline of something long swaying from behind it. A tail. Not a stubby one like a bear's, but long and swinging. That stopped me. Bears don't have tails like that. I sat there blinking, squinting, trying to make sense of it. The head was still big, the shoulders broad, but the movement was slow and lazy. Not like a predator. I unzipped the tent a tiny bit and reached out. My fingers brushed the plastic frames of my glasses. I pulled them in and slid them on. My vision cleared and everything changed. It was a cow. A huge, dusty brown cow, just standing there outside the tent, flicking flies off its back with that long tail. Its ribs showed through its hide, and its eyes were dull, barely interested in me or the tent, just chewing, calm as anything. I felt like I'd been holding my breath for 10 minutes. My hands were still shaking, my chest heaving like I'd just run a mile. I laughed, not out of humor, but the kind of laugh that comes when your body doesn't know what else to do. After a few minutes, the cow wandered off, and I watched it push through the underbrush toward the trees. Apparently, this area wasn't just bear country. It was also open range for cattle. No fences, just wandering livestock in the middle of nowhere. Arizona is weird like that. The rest of the evening passed in a strange haze. When my boyfriend got back, I didn't tell him right away. I just sat by the fire, staring into the flames, trying to process the whole day. The car breaking down, the withdrawal, the panic, and now this. A cow. Eventually, I told him. He laughed a little, but I could tell he was also surprised. We moved our food into the car that night just in case. And I slept with my glasses on, one hand on the zipper, just in case something bigger than a cow came wandering by next time. We stayed for 2 nights. It wasn't all bad. Some parts were even nice. The stars were incredible. The air smelled like pine and dust. And in the quiet moments, I felt something settle inside me. Like maybe I could actually stick with quitting. Maybe I didn't need the crutch of smoking, even if my hands still shook and my head still pounded. But I never forgot that feeling. That sick, creeping fear that comes when you think you're alone in the woods with something dangerous. That panic, that helplessness, all sparked by a blur through a tent wall. It reminded me that nature doesn't care about your anxiety, your plans, your withdrawal symptoms. Out there, it's just you, your senses, and whatever moves through the trees. And sometimes it's just a cow. But next time, I told myself, I'd keep my glasses inside the tent. Started out as a solo trip, something I'd done plenty of times before. I like camping alone. Always have. Something about not having to talk to anyone. not having to plan around anyone else's schedule, not having to make small talk or pretend to be in a good mood. It helps me clear my head. I don't do the group campfire thing or the RV parks. I find a quiet trail, hike in far enough that I don't see other people, and pitch my tent somewhere out of sight of the trail. It's how I decompress. This time I'd picked a spot just outside of Phoenix. Still Arizona, still dry and rocky, but far enough out that I figured I'd be mostly alone. I planned for 2 nights, maybe 3 if I felt good. I brought a 50-liter pack, filled it with everything I'd need: tent, water, dry food, stove, extra socks, a tarp in case of wind. My boots were worn in, my steps were familiar. I checked the forecast a dozen times. Dry, high in the mid-80s, cold at night. Exactly what I expected. I drove out on a Thursday morning, left my car at a small dirt lot that bordered some BLM land, and headed up into the hills with my gear. The trail started off broad and clear. Sandy switchbacks, lots of loose rock. Saguaros stood like statues in every direction. Ocotillos stretched their spindly arms toward the sky. I kept my pace steady, drinking water every half hour or so. The sun was sharp, but not unbearable. I didn't see anyone for the first 2 miles, which was what I'd hoped for. I passed a dry creek bed, climbed up past a ridge, and followed an unmarked spur trail that seemed to slope away from the usual foot traffic. I walked for nearly 5 hours total, stopping once to eat a protein bar and stretch out my legs. Eventually, I found a flat little shelf on the side of a hill, just big enough for my tent and a small fire ring. A few boulders sat nearby, good for sitting. Below me, the desert dropped off into a shallow canyon filled with brittle grass, sun-bleached rock, and the twisting skeletons of dried-out trees. There was no wind, no sound except the distant buzz of insects. I dropped my pack and set up camp. By the time I finished pitching the tent and unrolling my sleeping pad, the shadows had started to stretch. I cooked a small meal on my stove, just a freeze-dried pouch of rice and beans, then sat on a flat rock and watched the sun dip behind the hills. The temperature fell quickly, the dry air drawing the warmth right out of me. I put on a fleece jacket and sat there until the stars came out. No fire. I didn't want to draw attention to myself. I'd done this kind of trip enough times to know that people were usually the only real threat, and I hadn't seen any out there. I figured I'd sleep well. That night, though, I woke up once around 2 a.m. My tent was cold, and I could hear something outside. Not close, just a rustling down near the canyon floor. Probably an animal, I told myself. I listened for a while, but it faded. Eventually, I drifted back to sleep. The next day, I got up with the sun and took a short hike without my pack. I followed the ridge east for about a mile, looking for signs of wildlife. I saw some small prints, probably a coyote, and a pile of sun-dried scat that looked like it came from a javelina. Nothing unusual. I looped back to camp by mid-morning, drank more water, and ate a handful of almonds. I rested in the shade for a while, reading from an old paperback I kept in my bag for trips like this. That afternoon, I went exploring again, this time heading west. The land dropped into a shallow bowl of granite and dirt. I scrambled down, careful not to twist an ankle, and followed a narrow wash that looked like it only filled with water once or twice a year. Around one bend, I found something that made me stop short. A shirt, just a plain, gray t-shirt, lying in the dirt, sun-bleached and dusty. At first I thought it had blown there, but there was no wind. I bent down and nudged it with a stick. No insects, no blood, nothing weird. Just a shirt. Looked like it had been there a while, but not long enough to fall apart. I kept going, thinking maybe someone had come through and dropped it. I started noticing other things. A sock half buried under a rock, the torn strap of what might have been a sandal, a small piece of foam padding like the kind used in backpack shoulder straps. I paused and looked around. The wash curved tightly here, almost like a corridor. There were no tire tracks, no recent footprints that I could see. Just the quiet, oppressive stillness of the desert. Felt wrong. Not like a danger wrong. More like I had wandered into something that wasn't mine. Like a space that someone else had claimed. I turned around and headed back to camp. That evening, I decided to make a fire after all. Not a big one. just enough to cook a hot meal and push back the growing feeling that I was being watched. I hadn't seen anyone, hadn't heard anything, but I couldn't shake it. That shirt, the sock, the bits of gear, they didn't feel like trash. They felt like evidence, like someone had been out here and not too long ago. I ate dinner, sipped water, and sat with my back to a boulder, facing my tent and the fire. My eyes scanned the dark spaces between the rocks, the edges of the canyon below. The stars were out in full, but the moon was small and faint. After a while, the fire died down and I crawled into my tent. I left my boots on just in case. Sometime after midnight, I heard something again. Not far this time. It wasn't an animal sound. It was the sound of a foot slipping against loose gravel. Then another. I held my breath. The tent fabric was thin and pale. It wouldn't hide anything if someone came close. I reached slowly for the small knife I kept tucked into the mesh pocket by my sleeping bag. The footsteps stopped. I waited, frozen. My heart thumped so hard I was sure it could be heard outside the tent. But there was no voice, no flashlight beam, no sound of movement. After what felt like an hour but was probably only minutes, I heard the crunch of footsteps retreating, slow, deliberate, not running. I stayed awake until dawn. As soon as the sky began to lighten, I unzipped the tent and scanned the area. There were footprints, bare ones, human. They led from the edge of the ridge toward my tent, then turned around and headed back toward the wash. Bare feet, out here. I packed up fast. My tent went down in minutes. I jammed everything into my pack, didn't even stop to eat. I just wanted to be gone. I followed my original trail back toward the car, but kept looking over my shoulder the whole time. About an hour into my hike out, I spotted movement ahead. My breath caught in my throat. I crouched low behind a patch of brush and waited. A man came around the bend in the trail naked. Completely naked. No shoes, no pack, no clothes. His skin was darkened by sun, streaked with dirt. His hair was long and tangled. He wasn't running. He was walking slowly like he did this often. His eyes were focused ahead, unblinking. He passed no more than 20 feet from me and didn't notice me. Or if he did, he didn't react. Once he was out of sight, I waited another 10 minutes before moving. My legs felt like rubber. My mouth was dry even though I'd been drinking water all morning. I kept going, faster now, not caring about the heat or the slope. My knees ached, and I stumbled once, scraping my palm, but I didn't stop. When I finally reached the car, I threw my pack in the back, climbed into the driver's seat, and locked the doors. I sat there for a minute, shaking. The silence of the desert pressed against the windows. On the drive home, I kept thinking about how exposed that man was. No shoes, no clothes, in the middle of the desert, walking as if he owned the place. And I guess in some ways, he did. I haven't gone camping since. I've done day hikes, gone fishing, driven through forests and deserts, but I don't sleep out there anymore. Not alone. I told a friend once, months later. He laughed a little, asked if I was sure I hadn't just stumbled across a nudist hiker. I didn't laugh. There was something about that man. His silence, his expression, the way he moved, that didn't feel accidental. It didn't feel like someone just out for an off-the-grid walk. It felt like I had wandered into a space that didn't belong to me, and whoever lived out there, barefoot and silent, was letting me know without saying a word. And maybe that was the best-case scenario. Maybe he just wanted to be left alone. But I still think about those footprints around my tent, about how close he came without making a sound, about how many nights he might have done that to others who never even woke up. The desert's big. There are places out there people don't go, and there are people out there who don't want to be found. I was lucky. I walked out, but I don't think I was alone out there. Not really, and I don't think I ever will be again. We drove out of Tucson around mid-afternoon on a Friday. It was one of those cloudless, dry Arizona days where even the wind feels like a hair dryer blowing in your face. I was in the passenger seat of my buddy Sean's truck. Behind us were two other cars packed with friends, coolers, tents, sleeping bags, and a bunch of dumb ideas. I say that now, but at the time it felt like we were just doing what every other group of young adults does when they want to feel alive. getting away from everything for a weekend. We weren't going to a campground. We wanted space, real space, out in the middle of nowhere, where you can pee wherever you want and blast music without getting a ticket. Sean's cousin had been out to a spot a couple of years back, about 2 hours southeast of the city, through dirt roads and past dried riverbeds, surrounded by those ugly beautiful hills and the low scrub brush that defines most of rural southern Arizona. By the time we got to the spot, it was nearing dusk. We set up camp in a semicircle, 3 tents and a fire pit we dug out with shovels. Our food was in the coolers, and we had enough beer to drown a horse. No cell service, no noise but the wind and the insects. There were 9 of us all together, mostly in our mid-20s, and not one of us thought to bring anything smarter than a flashlight and a Glock. The first night was normal. Drinking, laughing, watching stars, telling each other scary stories like kids, even though none of us really believed in any of that. I remember crawling into my sleeping bag at around 2 a.m., not drunk, just tired. The quiet out there is different from the quiet in a city. You can hear your heart beating, and it makes you feel like you're being watched even when you're not. I chalked it up to the darkness and tried to sleep. I must have dozed off because the next thing I remember was waking up to a faint sound. At first I thought it was one of the guys getting up to take a leak, but it kept going, a soft, wet kind of sound, like sniffing. I lay there, eyes wide open, trying not to move. It was outside the tent, that much was clear. I felt my girlfriend shift next to me. I didn't move, just listened. A second later, the sniffing moved. Not away, just to the other side of the tent. I knew then that she was awake too. Her body stiffened like mine had. Then we both heard it. Soft crunching, like slow footsteps moving to the next tent over. I didn't say a word. Nobody did. It was like a silent signal had passed through all of us in the tent. Something was outside. Something that didn't feel like it belonged. I could hear the breathing change in the tent next to us. The way people breathe when they're scared but trying to keep quiet. Then, a zipper noise. One of our friends, Nate, had unzipped his tent and suddenly shouted, banging something metal, maybe a pan or his gun. I couldn't see him, but I heard the panic in his voice, even though I couldn't make out the words. He was making noise on purpose. Then we heard footsteps. Heavy, rushed ones, like someone stumbling over rocks and brush. Not running like a wild animal, but tripping like a human in the dark. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't a mountain lion. It was a man. Nate saw him. The guy had been rummaging through our coolers and then decided to sniff our tents. No flashlight, no gear, just wandering barefoot or in socks or something. My heart felt like it was trying to dig a hole in my chest to escape. After we made sure no one was hurt and the guy was long gone, we packed up. Nobody wanted to stay. Not with that kind of crazy out there, and especially not when he'd been so quiet, so close. By the time we were driving out, it was nearly dawn. Tired, wired, and nervous, we made it back to Tucson in silence. You'd think that would be enough, but nope. A year later, we went back. Different spot, about 20 miles away from the first one. You know, just far enough that we thought we'd be safe. Smarter this time, or so we thought. Instead of tents, we decided to sleep in our trucks and SUVs. The logic. Lockable doors and high ground. No tents to sniff.
No surprise visits.
It was colder that year. Early fall. We made a decent fire, kept it going until about midnight, then started heading to our respective vehicles. I was in the back of my SUV with my girlfriend. A blanket laid down and some pillows. Window cracked slightly for air. I remember drifting off to sleep to the sound of wind in the trees and a friend snoring softly by the fire. And then, just like the year before, I woke up with that feeling. That heavy pressure in your gut that tells you something is wrong even before your brain catches up. I opened my eyes, and there it was, a light. Not blinding, but enough to light up the entire inside of the SUV through the window. Not flickering like a flashlight being waved around. This was still steady, like someone holding it 2 feet from the glass. I froze. My body tensed, and I stopped breathing. My girlfriend stirred beside me, but I gently pressed my hand on her side, hoping she'd stay quiet. I didn't know if she was fully awake or not, but I didn't want to move. The light stayed there for what felt like forever. I couldn't see the person holding it because of the angle, but I could tell they were close. Then slowly it moved. Not away, but to the next vehicle. I risked lifting my head just enough to see through the opposite window. There he was, an older man, maybe in his late 50s or 60s, wearing what looked like a thick, stained coat and jeans. Just standing there, holding a flashlight, staring into my buddy's truck bed. He didn't move for a long time, just stood still like a damn statue. Then slowly he moved on. I waited until he was out of sight, and then I got out, waking the others. Turned out a few of them had seen him too, but like me, they'd stayed quiet, hoping not to draw attention. We didn't scream. We didn't make a scene. We packed every sleeping bag, cooler, chair, tossed into the beds of the trucks in less than 10 minutes. No one said a word. I took the lead, driving down the narrow dirt road in the dark, watching the side mirrors for movement the entire way out. We never called the police. I don't even know what we would have said. A guy sniffed our tents one year, then showed up again a year later, shining lights in our cars while we were asleep. They'd laugh, tell us the desert is full of weirdos. After that trip, I stopped going on backwoods camping trips. If it's not a place with rangers or cell signal, I'm out. I still think about those 2 nights. What if Nate hadn't made noise that first time? What if the guy had a weapon? What if he came back a 3rd time? I think the scariest part wasn't that we were being watched. It was that both times he never tried to talk, never asked for food or help. He just sniffed, just stared, as if we were something less than human to him, like animals in cages or maybe something to collect. Some things don't need monsters to be scary. Sometimes, just one person in the wrong place at the wrong time is enough to burn an image into your brain you'll never get rid of. That guy is one of them, and every time I hear a twig snap in the dark, I think of him standing there with that quiet flashlight watching. It was early September when I took a week off from work and drove up to Washington State with my buddy for a camping trip. We'd planned this for a while. Just 2 guys, a cooler full of food, some gear, and a break from the noise of normal life. The spot we picked was near Olympic National Park, tucked deep into the forest. I'd been there once before a couple of years back, but only briefly. The place stuck with me, though. Tall trees that reached forever into the sky, soft earth under your feet, that quiet stillness that makes you feel like you're far from everything. And you are. We got in late afternoon and picked a site with a fire ring and a pull-off for the car. There weren't many people around, just 1 or 2 other campsites visible, but they were far enough that it still felt like we were alone. There was a picnic table and a small clearing between the trees where we could set up the tent. Everything looked perfect. The air was crisp, smelled like pine and moss. The light came in beams through the trees, like gold streaks over green leaves. If you've ever camped in a place like that, you know what I'm talking about. There's nothing like it. We set up the tent, built a fire, and spent the first night just unwinding. It was cold but not freezing, the kind of cold that wakes you up a little. The fire cracked and popped, and we had our beers and hot dogs, sitting in those collapsible camping chairs, just watching the sky go dark. I remember thinking how quiet it was. No cars, no buzzing of city lights, just wind and trees and some distant owl calls. That first night, I slept all right. Woke up a couple times from some rustling sounds, but it wasn't anything out of the ordinary. Forests have animals, that's part of the deal. Probably raccoons or something digging through fallen leaves. I didn't even bother unzipping the tent to look. By the 2nd day, we hiked around a bit, gathered more wood, cooked some simple meals, and just chilled. It wasn't until the late afternoon of that 2nd day that I noticed something weird. I was walking back from the small pit toilet structure they had near the site. Just a little wooden shed kind of thing, no plumbing, just a deep hole with a seat, and I heard this weird thud against the car. At first, I figured it was a branch falling. Trees drop things all the time. But then there was another thud, and another. Not heavy, but sharp. Something small. I turned and looked toward the car, and saw a pine cone roll down from the hood. Another one landed just after, bouncing off the windshield and landing in the grass. I paused and looked up. Nothing immediately visible, just trees and sky. The wind wasn't strong either. It was still, and that's what made it strange. Pine cones fall, yeah, but not usually 3 in a row with nothing pushing them. I kept walking and stood by the car, just looking around. Nothing up there. No movement in the branches. I shrugged it off. Weird, but I had no reason to suspect anything. Later that night, we sat around the fire again. I brought it up, more like a joke than anything. Said I thought the forest was throwing stuff at us. My buddy laughed, said maybe a squirrel had beef with the car or something. That made sense, I guess. I'd seen squirrels act territorial before, and they're not exactly shy in some places. Still, it was just strange how consistent the throws were. Not falling from branches randomly, actually hitting the car. Direct hits. But again, I let it go. The third day is when it started getting unsettling. We'd gone for a long hike that afternoon and came back near dusk. The sky was dimming fast and we were tired. Our shoes were muddy and I could feel the beginnings of blisters forming under my heels. As we approached the car, I saw more pine cones on the hood. 5 or 6 this time, and a few sticks. Small, thin ones. It looked like someone had dumped them from above. Not just fallen. Some of them had bounce marks like they'd hit with force. This time I did look up into the trees more carefully. I even walked around the car slowly, scanning the canopy. The wind had picked up just a little, and I remember watching the branches sway lightly. Nothing up there. No movement. No rustling. I started to feel it then, that slight twist in your stomach. That little pulse behind your neck when something doesn't quite line up the way it should. It wasn't fear, not yet, but unease. My buddy didn't seem too bothered. He just brushed the cones off the windshield and said we'd probably parked under a squirrel nest or something. That night, I couldn't sleep. Not really. I kept waking up to small noises. Things falling. I could hear them. Pine cones or maybe twigs, tapping lightly on the car. Once, there was a sharper crack like a stick breaking near the edge of the clearing. I sat up, zipped open the tent flap slightly, and peeked out. The fire had burned down to embers. Everything was dark, except the faint moonlight cutting through the trees. The car was there, still. I didn't see anything moving, but I also noticed that the roof now had even more pine cones. Too many for it to be coincidence. I listened for a long time, maybe 20 minutes. No more sounds, just wind. Eventually, I laid back down, but I didn't fall asleep for a while. The next morning, we found the side mirror cracked. It wasn't broken completely, just chipped, like something had been thrown at it hard and glanced off. There was a smear, too, a small smudge of dirt across the glass, as if something muddy had hit it and bounced away. Now I started getting seriously uncomfortable. It wasn't just pine cones. Something had been thrown hard enough to damage the car. Maybe a stick, maybe a rock. And if it was a squirrel, it had better aim than I've ever seen. But again, no sign of anything. No tracks, no nests above. Just a scattering of debris around the car. Always the car. We moved it to a different part of the clearing. Pulled it up a bit further from the trees. There weren't many other spots, but we figured maybe parking closer to the tent and farther from overhanging branches would help. Didn't. That evening, we found more stuff near the wheels. Not just cones now, pieces of bark and even a small clump of moss. I swear it looked like it had been pulled right off a nearby tree. Fresh, still wet. There were also scratches on the passenger door. Not deep, but definitely new. They weren't there when we got in earlier. That night was the worst. Around midnight, I woke up to the sound of something hitting metal hard. Not just the tapping sounds from before. This was loud, sharp. It echoed across the clearing. I sat up instantly, heart thudding. My buddy was already awake, flashlight in hand, though he didn't turn it on. We listened. Then it happened again. A loud thud, then another, like someone was throwing rocks at the car. Not small ones either, bigger, solid hits. I could hear the slight ring of impact, the way metal hums for a second after being hit. I unzipped the flap and looked out, ready to switch on my headlamp. But I stopped myself. The fire was dead out, the sky overcast. It was almost pitch black. I couldn't see anything except the faint silhouette of the car. No movement, no figures. And then it stopped. Just like that, silence again. No footsteps, no running, just nothing. We waited. Minutes passed. Still no sound. Eventually, I lay back down, though I kept the flashlight close. I didn't really sleep. I was too keyed up, waiting for the next hit. Morning came slow. I dragged myself out of the tent the moment light started creeping in. The car looked worse. There were streaks of dirt across the hood, more scratches, and this part I'll never forget. A single large pine cone wedged under the windshield wiper. Not fallen there, wedged, placed. That was the last straw. We packed up fast, barely ate. I didn't even care about the food left in the cooler. I just wanted out of there. We threw everything in the back, and I drove, tired, jumpy, and filled with a steady knot of nervous energy. As we got onto the main road and the trees started thinning out, I finally started to breathe again. The air felt lighter, brighter. I didn't realize how heavy the forest had felt until we left it behind. Later that day, when we stopped at a gas station, I looked over the car again. The scratches weren't deep, but they were real, all clustered on one side. The mirror chip was worse than I remembered. And inside the wheel well, stuffed into the plastic lip above the tire, was another pine cone, smashed and broken, like it had been jammed in and shaken around. I still don't know what was up there. Could have been a squirrel, I guess. Maybe a raccoon with a grudge. But squirrels don't throw things that hard. They don't aim and they don't wedge things under windshield wipers. Whatever it was, it didn't want us there. It waited until night, stayed hidden, and went after the one thing we couldn't hide inside a tent. Was it territorial? Maybe. Was it just messing with us? Possible. But I never saw it. Not once. And I watched that forest like a hawk. Whatever it was, it stayed out of sight, and that's what made it worse. You can handle animals. You can scare them off. But not being able to see something that's messing with you? That's a different kind of fear. We haven't been back to that part of Washington since. I've always liked pushing things just a little too far. Not in a reckless way, I don't think I'm stupid, but just enough to see what might happen. I don't always think it through in the moment. Sometimes I chase the feeling of freedom a little too hard, especially when I think I can get away with something. So when I rented that car, an old Kia Forte from a no-name agency, dirt cheap and scratched already, and my brother suggested we take it through the woods behind his place, I didn't hesitate. It was one of those things that just felt like it would be fun. No one was going to see us, the area was private, and we weren't far from home. We weren't even planning to go far, just around the woods for a bit, then back. What I didn't expect was for something so simple to go so weird so fast. It started on a Saturday. My brother lived in a rural part of upstate New York, right on the edge of a big patch of forest that backed into our mom's property. We both grew up out there, so we knew those woods. Not every inch, but enough. There were old trails winding through the brush from when we used to bike and hike and sneak off with friends to build forts or smoke behind dead logs. That sort of thing. There was a rough path that connected his backyard to Mom's, but you had to make a couple turns to get there because the woods didn't run in a straight line. He told me he'd recently widened part of it with a chainsaw and that we could probably drive it now. Said he'd done it with his truck a few times, no problem. I figured the Kia might not be the best off-road vehicle, but it was already beat up. I had the rental for 2 more days. What the hell? We waited until early evening, just before sunset. I think we both thought that would make it cooler. The shadows getting long, the bugs starting to come out, air going cold enough to make your arms goosebump. I drove, of course. He sat passenger, one arm resting out the window, beer sweating in his hand. The woods swallowed the sound of our tires as we left the grass and dipped into the trail behind his house. First, it went fine. The Kia's suspension groaned, but it held together. The dirt was dry and packed, not muddy. Tree roots jutted out like knuckles across the ground, and I did my best to avoid the biggest ones. The deeper we went, the less I thought about the car and the more I thought about the woods. The smell of it all. Wet bark, rotting leaves, that cold green scent of moss. It all felt familiar, even comforting. We drove slow, no more than 10 or 15 miles an hour. The sun dropped lower. The woods darkened faster than I expected. Trees on either side of us crowded close, limbs scraping the doors. My brother pointed out where he'd cut back some brush the week before. I saw some stumps and fresh sawdust. But further down, it started to get thick again. The first turn we made curved us around a shallow rise where the land dropped off on the right. We kept left, crawling up a hill. I remember thinking that I hadn't been this way in years, maybe a decade. The trail wasn't well used anymore. A fallen log lay half buried in mud just off to the side, and the path twisted tighter than I remembered. I slowed to a crawl, headlights throwing shadows that looked longer and darker than they should have. Then I made the second turn. It wasn't sharp, just a wide bend to the left, right before the woods opened up a little. I rounded it at a crawl, and that's when we saw them. I didn't even process what I was looking at for a second. Just glowing dots, dozens of them, hovering in the dark just ahead of the headlights. My foot slammed on the brake, and we both lurched forward. That's what they were. Reflections of the headlights in 24 pairs of eyes. Low to the ground, scattered all across the path ahead and into the trees on either side. Yellow and glassy. Still, we both froze. My hands went cold on the wheel. It was a herd of deer, at least 20 of them, maybe more. I couldn't see them all clearly at first, but as the car idled, the brights picked up their shapes. Slender bodies, ears twitching, legs tensed. They were lying down when we came around the corner, resting, maybe hiding. I don't know, but as the car rolled toward them and the lights hit, they didn't jump up. Not right away. We were maybe 50 feet out when the nearest one started rising. Not frantic, but deliberate, like a crowd getting to their feet in slow motion. One by one, the sound of hooves shifting against dry leaves was loud, too loud. I realized we were barreling toward them. I tried to stop. My foot was already on the brake, but the dirt was loose and uneven. The car skidded slightly and jolted forward. I thought we were going to hit them, but then, like a single organism, they bolted. Not toward us, not in a scatter. All at once, they turned and surged to the left, down into the dark part of the woods. Fast. Too fast for the eye to follow. The whole herd disappeared between the trees. The crash of movement faded almost instantly, swallowed by the thick woods. And then it was just us, alone on a dirt trail in a rented Kia, headlights burning into empty space. My chest was tight.
I realiza ide stupidbrating.
I rolled forward a few feet, cautiously, then stopped again. I looked left and right. Nothing. No movement. No sound. Not even birds. That should have been the end of it. Deer spooked by a car. No harm done. But it wasn't the end, because something was off. Something about how they moved. Deer are nervous animals. Skittish. They run at the slightest sound. But these deer hadn't run right away. They just stared, still as statues. It wasn't right. It was like they had been waiting. We didn't say anything, just sat there. I kept the car in park and listened, waiting to hear them move further off. But there was nothing. Eventually, I started rolling forward again, slower this time. We made it maybe a quarter mile further before I saw more eyes. Only this time, it wasn't a whole herd, just one, off to the right side of the trail, about 20 feet into the trees, standing perfectly still between two thick trunks. It was staring at us. I stopped again. We both leaned forward to look. It didn't move, just stood there, barely visible, face half lit in the beam. I eased the car forward. It didn't flinch. I kept going, turned its head slightly, tracking us, but didn't run. That's when I started to feel uneasy in a deeper way. Something crawled up the back of my neck. My gut tightened. It wasn't fear yet, but something close, like the beginning of fear, like knowing a storm is about to break before you feel the rain. I don't remember much about the next few turns. I was focused on the trail. I knew we had to be getting close to the clearing behind our mom's house, but the trail felt longer than it used to, more twisted. I second-guessed every turn, squinting through the headlights, trying to recognize familiar trees or stumps, but everything looked wrong. Then we heard it, a thud, soft but sharp, from behind the car. I stopped again, threw it in park. We sat in silence, windows open, listening. Another thump, closer. I turned around in my seat, looking out the back window. Nothing, But then something darted across the trail maybe 30 yards behind us. Fast and low. I couldn't tell what it was. Deer? Coyote? Then another. Same shape. Same speed. I shifted into drive and started moving again. This time faster. The trail narrowed. Branches scraped the sides of the car. I winced at the sound, but I didn't stop. I just wanted to get out of the woods. We burst into a small clearing, headlights spilling out across the uneven grass. I recognized it then. An old meadow behind Mom's house, overgrown but still familiar. We made it. I drove straight across it, through the gap in the trees, and out onto the wide path that led to her backyard. Once we hit her lawn, I stopped, got out, walked a few paces into the grass, and turned around to look back into the woods. It was quiet, but just before I turned away, I saw them again. 2 deer, standing at the edge of the trees, still, watching. I got back in the car and we drove around front, parked, went inside, didn't talk about it for the rest of the night. Later, lying in bed, I kept thinking about how they moved. The herd that didn't spook until the last second. The deer that stared from the trees. The shapes that darted behind us, silent and fast. It wasn't fear exactly, but it stuck with me. 2 days later, when I returned the rental, I checked the undercarriage. It was scratched up worse than I thought. One of the plastic guards was cracked. I told them I'd taken it down some country roads. They didn't ask questions. I didn't offer more. I've been back to the woods since, once or twice, but I haven't driven that trail again. And I think about it more than I should, because it was just deer. That's all they were. But they moved like they knew something I didn't. They moved like they had a plan. And in that moment, when 24 glowing eyes looked straight through us, I didn't feel like the one in control anymore. Just lucky. Lucky they decided to run the other way. I had been planning a desert camping trip for a while. It was early spring, and the idea of wide, dry open land with cool nights and empty silence had been calling to me. I'd done mountain hikes, forest trails, and riverbank camps, but I hadn't spent real time in the desert, just crossed through it on road trips. This time, I wanted to park the car, hike out on foot, and stay overnight in the open, just me and the sand and the wind. The area I picked was remote. I found it through a dusty old blog about forgotten camping spots. It was part of a high desert region in the southwest. Not a national park, just BLM land, public and unregulated. You had to bring everything you needed because nothing was provided. No bathrooms, no water spigots, no signs. It was the kind of place where you could go a whole weekend without seeing another human. Exactly what I was looking for. I packed carefully. I brought 6 liters of water, dehydrated food for 3 days, a small gas burner, a sleeping pad, a one-man tent, a basic first aid kit, satellite GPS, and a detailed paper map. I wore light boots, canvas pants, and a long-sleeve shirt to keep the sun off me. I also packed a hat, sunglasses, sunblock, a headlamp, and 2 knives. I made sure everything was double-checked before I left. I drove out early on a Friday morning and got to the trailhead by noon. The gravel road that brought me there was barely a road at all. My car kicked up a huge cloud of dust that hung in the air even after I parked and stepped out. I locked the car, threw on my pack, and started walking. The first thing I noticed was the quiet. It wasn't like the quiet you get in the forest, with birds chirping and wind in the trees. This was dead quiet, the kind of quiet that made your ears ring. Just the crunch of my boots on hard-packed dirt and the occasional gust of hot wind. The landscape was dry and brown, dotted with jagged rocks and little clumps of cactus. I followed a faint trail for about 5 miles, then veered off toward a group of low, flat-topped hills I'd seen on the map. I wanted to set up camp near the base of one, just where a dry creek bed twisted out like a scar. By late afternoon, I reached it. The sun was already dropping, casting long shadows across the rock. I found a small rise overlooking the creek bed and set up my tent there. The ground was mostly firm sand with patches of gravel and dry grass. I cleared an area for my tent, laid down my mat, and unrolled the sleeping bag inside. I was sweating, covered in dust, and my legs were tired, but I felt good. I boiled water on my little burner and made a pouch of freeze-dried chili. I sat on a flat rock, eating slowly, watching the horizon glow orange, then pink, then darken into deep purple. The temperature dropped fast, and I pulled on a hoodie. That night, I sat outside for a long time, watching stars appear like pinholes in black fabric. I had never seen so many at once. The desert sky was massive, stretching above me without end. Eventually, I crawled into my tent and zipped it shut. The night was cold but calm. I slept light but steady. The next morning, I woke up with the sun. I had coffee and oatmeal, then went exploring around the area, taking photos, checking the old creek bed for signs of animals. I found small tracks, maybe fox, maybe rodent, but nothing big. The sand was dry and cracked in places, curled like paper. I stayed close to camp most of the day, resting, reading a book I brought, and trying not to move too much in the heat. In the late afternoon, I decided to do one more loop before dinner. I walked about half a mile along the base of the hill, following the edge of a boulder field. I liked how the shadows stretched and changed as the sun sank again. I was walking carefully, stepping between rocks. When it happened, I felt a sudden twitch under my foot, like a tiny spring snapping, and then something sharp brushed my ankle. I jumped back instinctively. My boot had landed on something alive, and it had tried to react. When I looked down, I saw it, a scorpion, pale beige, almost the same color as the dust, maybe 3 inches long, flat body, claws splayed. It wasn't moving much, but it wasn't dead either. Its tail was bent sideways in a weird angle. The stinger was there, but not lifted up the way I'd seen in videos. I stared at it for a while, heart pounding, half crouched and sweating cold. I realized I must have stepped directly on the tail, pinning it down. Maybe I had crushed something in the joint. That thing could have stung me. I was wearing boots, but if I'd stepped wrong, or if it had gotten my ankle above the top of the boot, it could have been bad. Real bad. I backed away slowly, watching it. Still didn't move much. I wasn't sure if it was dying or just stunned. But either way, I didn't go closer. I made my way back to camp with my heart thudding the whole time. My ankle didn't hurt, which was good, but I couldn't stop thinking about how close that had been. I sat down and pulled off my boot and sock to check. Nothing, just a little scratch from the brush. Still, I cleaned it and wrapped it loosely just in case. The thought of venom crawling up my leg wouldn't leave my mind. I ate dinner but didn't enjoy it. Every shadow outside the firelight felt like it was hiding something. I kept thinking about how many more scorpions might be out there, under rocks, under my tent, inside my boots. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept the headlamp on low and stared at the roof of the tent. Every small sound outside, wind in the grass, pebbles shifting, made my muscles tense. I stayed zipped up, trying to control my breathing. I didn't fall asleep until well after midnight. When I woke up again, it was still dark. I had heard something, not an animal exactly, more like a thump, like something heavy had dropped nearby. I didn't move. I just lay still, listening. Another thump, closer, not soft like a squirrel or bird. This was bigger. I slowly unzipped the tent door an inch and peeked out. The desert was dim in the moonlight, but I could make out a shape, a figure of some kind, crouched near where I had left my pack. My stomach dropped. I thought it might be a coyote or a bobcat, but it wasn't moving like one. Then it stood up. It was a person. I froze. The figure was thin, average height, wearing a hooded jacket or coat. They didn't have a flashlight, just moved slowly and silently, touching things near my stuff. I stayed dead quiet. My heart was hammering in my chest, so loud I thought they might hear it. I didn't know if I should yell, or try to sneak out, or just wait. My knife was in my boot by the flap of the tent. No way to get to it without unzipping more. The figure moved toward the tent. I held my breath, but then, just as suddenly, they turned and walked away, back toward the hill. No sound, no light, just vanished into the dark. I lay there for what felt like an hour before I dared to move. When the sun finally started to rise, I unzipped the tent fully and stepped out. My legs were shaky. I checked my pack. Nothing missing. Nothing moved. I checked for footprints, faint impressions in the dirt, heading toward the rocks. I didn't see where they led. I packed everything in record time. I didn't eat. I didn't even drink. I just threw everything into the pack, slung it over my shoulder, and started walking. I didn't take the scenic way back. I didn't stop to take photos. I didn't look at the hills. I kept my eyes on the trail and my ears sharp. I walked fast even though my legs felt like stone. It took me just over 2 hours to get back to the car. When I saw it, I almost cried. I unlocked it, tossed my gear in the back, and drove away, tires spitting gravel. I didn't stop until I hit the nearest town. Small place with a gas station and a diner. I pulled into the lot, sat behind the wheel for 5 minutes just to breathe, then went inside. I ordered eggs and toast and sat near the window, looking out at the horizon. I thought about everything that had happened, how close the scorpion came to nailing me, how close that person came to my tent. I thought about how I had wanted silence and isolation, but I hadn't been ready for what came with it. The desert didn't care that I was careful. It didn't care that I planned things out. It gave me something raw, something I'll never forget. When I got home, I unpacked slowly. I washed everything twice. I checked every inch of my pack and my boots. I kept thinking about that scorpion, how its tail was bent at a weird angle, how it had twitched under my foot. It had probably tried to sting, but couldn't. I got lucky, real lucky. Now I still go camping. I still go out into wild places. But I've learned to respect the land more than I ever did before. I double-check where I step. I never leave boots outside the tent. And I always carry my knife where I can reach it in the dark. And I never forget that even in the quietest places, you're never really alone.